Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome from the Department of Comparative Literature at JUCL University. Today is a very special day for us because as we inaugurate one of the first events being organized by the Center for Studies in Islamicate Asia, coordinator being Professor Girish Chandra Sen. The center, as we would know and understand in the coming years, proposes to study intellectual and cultural exchanges across an Arabicate and Persianate Asia in a comparative framework to understand the multitude of Asia beyond the parameters of the area studies and add a new dimension to the existing thematic and methodological concerns of the Department of Comparative Literature at JUCL University. One of the things that I would also like to say here is that comparative literature has often tried to offer a vision of another India, an outward-looking, eager-eyed, open-armed India. And for this, I think this center is very crucial for us to develop our understanding of that. And it gives me great pleasure to perhaps initiate the NAMA for the center with this event. And thank you so much, Professor Bose, for being with us today and everyone who has come here. We have a little token that we would like to give Professor Bose. So this is a poster that has been designed by Shreyashi and a volume of the Journal of Comparative Literature. So if you could take that. This is the poster. So thank you. And I would therefore hand over this to Shitali if you could begin the process. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. So this is a dream comes true moment for me actually, and I'm really thankful to my colleagues for giving me such support, generous support to make this happen. One thing that special mention, that is, we are quite elated to have Professor Neilesh Bose to begin this session to inaugurate the first formal session for the Center for Studies in Islamicate Asia. His book, Recasting the Region, Language, Culture and Islam in Colonial Bengal, published by the Oxford University Press in 2014, by encompassing a vast time frame from the late 19th century to Mukti Juddha, that is the liberation war of Bangladesh in 1971, not only adds significantly to the scholarship that came after Rafiuddin Ahmed's 1981 book, The Bengal Muslim, 1871 to 1905, A Quest for Identity. Recasting the region, like the Bengal Muslims, has truly inspired many of us who intended to work on the Bengal Muslims, and I can see the faces of my colleagues and friends in this audience. But without further ado, I invite Professor Kunal Chattopadhyay to chair today's section. So Kunal Chattopadhyay is Professor of Comparative Literature and former Professor of History at JUCL University. His interests cover the Russian Revolution, Marxist politics, the reception of Marxist cultural theories in India, and communalism and politics. He has written and edited around 15 books. These include The Marxism of Leo Trotsky, 2006, Leo Trotsky, Writings in Exile, 2017. He has written numerous articles and papers, including substantial contribution on India in the International Encyclopedia of Revolution and Protest. Thank you, Kunal. Over to you.
Tear away from what were called accretions from rituals and to find what the primary sources were. As Roy mentioned later in his life, that these sources were hidden by the language of Sanskrit, termed by him a dark curtain that would hide the pearls of wisdom in those primary sources. And at the end of his discussions, this is in the 1810s and 20s, he clarified that monotheism, according to him, was at the basis of early Indian religion, and therefore the basis of any discussion of religion itself in India. He did many other things throughout his life. I'm not going to discuss all of them, but the core point of his work, which included also translating from many Upanishads, was to create a corpus of texts that would support the notion that there was monotheism in ancient India. His last substantive work was called The Universal Religion, Religious Instruction Founded on Sacred Authorities. It emerges in 1829. It is a series of questions and answers between a teacher and a student. And this universal religion is eagerly promoted by his friends on one hand, Unitarian Christians of Calcutta, who were rising in number in the 1810s and 20s, and members of a group that later would be called the Brahmo Samaj, a reformist organization that was formally begun in 1828, the year in which they create a trust deed which lays out a series of rules for the members of this group. By the 1840s, they had started to issue a journal from 1843, Dr. Bodhani Potrika, and then a book, Brahmo Porno, 1848, which lays out the lineaments of a new religion based on researches that were begun in Roy's time on what they called all the religions of the world. Now, about a decade after the appearance of that new society and new religion, after the 1857-58 comparison itself emerged with Girish Chandra Sen, who is pictured here, alive from 1838 to 1884, who joined the Brahmo Samaj in the 1860s and who brings forth a whole variety of interesting bits of biography, which I will not speak of, but speak more of his relationship to religion vis-a-vis text and his approach to comparison and to reform. From the 1860s, he began to publish various works of synthesis of different religions throughout the world. And in 1869, he oversaw production of a new temple, the Brahmo Mandir, which was built in a new style which aimed to synthesize and put into visual form different religions of India into one new religion. And this is something that we see here on the left. It also was a time when he and others began new practices through the Ashram, 1872, an experimental living community where members of this group would live and learn and have access to the world's various traditions. Underneath this dispensation, it was called a new dispensation. There emerged a project of formally studying the various religions of the world from 1879. And missionaries were ordained to study various religions: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism. Missionaries ordained to study bhakti and devotion, to study Vaishnavism, to study Sikhism. And this dispensation had apostles, which were of course clearly designed after the apostles of Christianity, and in particular Paul was the major inspiration for this whole endeavor, which would spread out into different parts of India, and in the words of Girish Chandra Sen, create a science, a new science of comparative religion. This was to the religion of Islam. It was part and parcel of the various investigations of the Brahmo Samaj, arguably from the very beginning of its existence from Rammohan Roy's time onward. Now, Islam in Bengal in particular, as studied by a range of scholars, including Dr. Halder here and many others, there is a vast scholarship on this topic, and I will not discuss all of those details, but I am happy to say more on this in the discussion period. But Islam has been present in South Asia since the beginning of Islam itself, and has had a manifestation in Bengal since at least the 13th century, if not earlier, as there are various hypotheses about the presence of Islam in various parts of the frontier regions of what is now Bangladesh from before the 13th century. But moving on to the 19th century, Bengal served as a home to a series of reformist movements in line with modern forms of religiosity characteristic of the time. Men such as Haji Sharifullah from Puripur in eastern Bengal, what is now Bangladesh, was one of the first, as many here know, to study in Al-Azhar in the early 19th century, at the very time of Rammohan Roy's rise, and began to critique practices that were designated Hindu, such as worshipping at dargahs, observing Hindu customs and pujas, and various other things that were seen as antithetical to Islam. It is being articulated in this form at the same time that the idea of world religion is also starting to be a part of our shared vocabulary. He began a movement called the Polarized movement, named after the reference to obligations to Islam, the Farai. His son, nicknamed Lumina, continued this movement in the eastern countryside in the 1830s, transforming it into a movement that had explicit politics to it, aimed at exposing and curtailing abuses of Muslim peasants against primarily Hindu landlords. In the early 20th century, a small but increasingly visible Muslim middle class had developed in colonial Bengal, which saw the rise of Muslims availing jobs in the public sphere, in business, universities, and in government. And new journals and new newspapers emerged in that moment in the 1900s and 1910s, which started to emphasize proper Muslim practices, primarily on the point of criticizing Christian missionary attacks on Islam. So this very brief 5-minute recounting of this history is the context for the entry of a figure like Girish Chandra Sen, who enters the history of Islam in Bengal in the middle of the 19th century. Born in 1835 and alive until 1910, born into a caste Hindu landscape, but converted into the new religion of Brahmos. From the early 1970s, became a missionary for the Brahmo Samaj, very close to Keshav Chandra Sen and to that ethos of comparison. To comparison as a method is something that was very close to him, confronting a great amount of resistance from his family and the life he left behind, like everybody else that would speak up, and spent most of the decade of the 1870s learning Persian, Arabic, and also tafsir as an adult. Very difficult task that he undertook. And whereas Rammohan Roy a century earlier had come from the rise and riches of Company Calcutta, Girish Chandra Sen, as Dr. Howlett has written in many spaces, grew up in the agrarian East and lived where the vernacular was being standardized in the late 19th century into a language with a grammar and primary teaching methods. This new so-called vernacular is often seen as being cemented through elite Hindu collusion by pundits and other highly placed Hindu Bengalis, but this is an example of the vernacular being dynamized by a perspective not from Bengali Hindus, but from the Brahmo Samaj. And from the early 1880s, with assistance from a Molvi in Lucknow, who taught him Arabic grammar, manners of reading the Quran, and tafsir, he translated the Quran for the first time into vernacular Bangla, though it of course had a presence in Bangla of various other types before this. It is now available in the 1880s into vernacular Bangla. It was published in 4 editions, first in the 1880s, then in 1892, and then 1908 and 1936. As many of you may know here, the great Muhammad Akram Khan lavished great praise on this project, as well as on the way that he did it. Because it was not done from the perspective of a Bengali Hindu. It was done to render the Quran accessible to readers of vernacular Bangla. The sort of language that it was written in, of course, departs from the earlier forms in which it was known primarily to Muslims. And so it is the first time that it is being made accessible to a non-Muslim readership. As Dr. Butler has analyzed in a forthcoming book, Sen conducted a line-by-line translation in idiomatic fashion, often combining lines and rendering the meaning as opposed to literally translating from Arabic. As his preface lists a set of obligations Muslims in India would have been aware of, such as facing west while praying, various ritual recitations that would have been common in India, he demonstrated a sensibility around the lived experience of Islam, which would have been completely inaccessible to most Bengali Hindus or non-Muslims of his era. He used three primary sources, primarily for his commentary. Again, he was training in tafsir as an adult. This is something that he accessed not from within a tradition. Tafsir Hussaini, Faida, and Jalalain. Hussaini was the most widely read in India in the 19th century. He was quite well versed in what Muslims would have been well versed in, from Shah Abdul Aziz all the way back to Waliullah. These works were something that he imbibed again as an adult and as a Brahmin, and this is what he is doing. He never used the term Allah in his first translation, terms of Ishur, Parameshwar, Bodhipati. These are terms that he used again in idiomatic form. And it was likely to be done so that the ideas, the truth contained within, would not alienate readers who would not have had any access to the Arabic in the manners that Muslims likely would have had. Ideas primarily about monotheism are really the core of his goal with this translation. There's much more to be said, but I'll just move on to some general thematic insights here. He himself was a prolific translator and writer. He wrote a total of 44 books in Bangla about a variety of subjects. So not only Islam, but this was most likely his signature contribution. But he also wrote about landmarks in Muslim history, Karbala, he wrote biographies. He demonstrated this openness, again at the beginning of the session, this openness not only to the world outside, but to the world within India, that this is accessing Islam within India. And the Sanskrit Buddhist literature of Nepal, that text by Rajendra Mitro, this text emerged in the 1880s as an inspiration for the Asiatic Society of Calcutta, which had been in existence for over a century, to start focusing on Buddhism. As they state in 1893, their goal was to make researches into ancient Indian Buddhists accessible to readers in English and into Bangla. So from that moment of the 1890s, 1900s, research into Pali, Tibetan, Burmese, Siamese, on the point of Buddhism, how it existed, and with the presumption that it was a bounded religion, this started to proceed in a quite advanced manner. Now, so in addition to the work of the Brahmo Samaj, this sector, the Calcutta intelligentsia, started to look at sources and texts and histories. In the 1890s, the Mohabodhi Society was founded, aimed to revive Buddhism in India. And as many of you may know, this is a time when the great Sri Lankan reformer, writer, and Buddhist Amrita Dharmapala starts to work on reviving Buddhism and to revive focus on both Gaya in the 1890s. What marks out Govardhan Gupta is that he is not one who is an urban intellectual. He's not supported by any university or learned society. He, like Girish Chandra Sen, he worked with those who he felt would be most important for this new religion of the Brahmo Samaj. He did, from available evidence, access texts published by the Asiatic Society. He did learn Pali and Sanskrit as well, but his message was not transformed into a nationalism like that of Dharmapala. His focus was on making Buddhism accessible, and like many others, as I have mentioned, to remake religion in India itself. This field of religion, not the only one in 19th century India to be sure, is not simply redolent of the Protestant imposition on the world, but it is the focus of a new synthetic religion to be created, to be positively engaged with, and it integrated aspects of these religions, Islam, Buddhism as well. So, one last figure that I would like to discuss in this investigation would be P.C. Mojumdar, alive from 1840 to 1905. He brings together nearly a century of thought and engagement about Jesus of Nazareth from a comparative religion's perspective. Born in 1840 in Hooghly, he was actually a cousin of Girish Chandra Sen. Joined the Brahmo Samaj in the late 1850s and was a very close confidant of Unitarian Christians like Charles Dow, who came to Calcutta in the 1850s, a very close friend of Keshav. Also a great reader of Theodore Parker, one of the most well-known American theologians of the 19th century, and was very influential in the communal circles of the 1870s. And he, Mojumdar, like many of the time, has a series of narratives of his, not conversion to Christianity, but his conversion to what he claims to be a religion of the spirit, which I'll talk about in just a minute. He, like everybody else in this history, spent considerable time outside of his home in Calcutta. Like all those who came before him, he traveled outside of what was familiar to him and had experienced 3 tours to the United States of America in the late 19th century, 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s. He first traveled upon the invitation of the American Unitarian Church, which was very eager to receive him, in 1882, a decade before Vivekananda had traveled to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. Now, I have studied extensively by a range of scholars, including Sunil Malik, whose book-length study investigates P.C. Majumdar in detail. I will here focus on 3 main texts that were very relevant to the history of comparative religion from India. 1, Faith and Progress in the Brahmo Samaj, 1882, in line with his first tour. Oriental Christ, 1883, and Spirit of God in 1894. Now all of them draw, as I said, on earlier precedents of thinking about Jesus of Nazareth. 1 is Rammohan Roy's book, Precepts of Jesus. It was written after the Bupa in the 1820s, after several years of study of the Old Testament and the history of Christianity. And it focused on the actual practices and behaviors of the historical Jesus. This is another big theme in the history of religion that has animated scholars of Christianity in the modern world, and claims that the historical Jesus provides lessons of ethical insight and may be appreciated without belief in the divinities that are contained within Christianity. But just the historical precedent is what is important. The other is Girish Chandra Sen's work on Jesus, including his 1866 speech, Jesus Christ, Europe and Asia, which is a study of Jesus' personality and his approach to life. Now, Mojumdar followed these conceptions of Jesus and claimed to find a Jesus that was separate from the version that was held and promoted by missionaries at the time. So Oriental Christ, this has 13 chapters, about 13 approaches to Christ, bathing Christ. He writes in a tradition of biographical writing, as noted by the scholar J. Barton Scott. As we know from Girish Chandra Sen's many works on Jesus and Rammohan Roy's works on Jesus, as well as others, that biography was a method to come to these larger conclusions about religion. As a measure of his life's work outside of India, all were published by one publisher, George Ellis of Boston, and this comes from his Unitarian Christian context, which had been cultivated through first a knowledge of Rammohan Roy's work, Precepts of Jesus, which was debated in English in Unitarian circles in New England. So, the introduction of Oriental Christ, it reviews Girish Chandra Sen's work on Christ and claims that the life and teachings of Jesus have been presented through European filters up until this time, 1880s, but they need to be done in an, quote, Asiatic way. This is the term that P.C. Majumdar uses. It's also the term Girish Chandra Sen used. So an Asiatic way would focus on metaphor, symbol, and ritual. For P.C. Majumdar, Christ is Asiatic because he is a renunciate, and he is in a process of constant transformation, and he is, quote, not the monopoly of any nation or creed. This moment of intercultural encounter offers a range of insights for religion It offers a way of thinking about comparative religion. On the topic of literature, the entire oeuvre of B.C. Ojandar constantly includes references to works of literature as analogs of thinking about how to read the history of Jesus. So this is something that is potentially of interest to those of you studying comparative literature. On the notion of a connected or a comparative world history. In this work and in Spirit of God, he claims that one may read Christianity and Hinduism side by side by trying to find those aspects of religious practice that are visible to both. One is the role of water, bathing, and he places this as central to his argument. He states that we men of the new dispensation are enjoined to bathe daily in the baptism of Jesus. We have united the sanctity of Christian baptism and Hindu ablution. He also, in this work, Pilgriming Christ, evokes the practice that Girish Chandra Sen began of convening pilgrimages in honor of great religious figures in history across time and space. This is something Girish Chandra Sen initiated in the 1880s of convening with great saints across history, starting with an appreciation of Jesus of Nazareth. As B.C. Ojandar mentions, as pilgrims, we approach the great saints, we commune with them in spirit, we kill the distance of time and space. We enter into them as they enter into us. In our souls, we cherish them, we imbibe their character and their principles. Here, as also in Faith and Progress of the Brahma Samaj, the first text, he introduces a historicity into the notion of religion itself. And he includes a section on how religion may be understood through logical sequences, such that the rise of Jesus as a historical figure emerges after Moses, which is also seen as an analog to how Buddhism emerges after Hinduism, how Sikhism emerges after various bhakti movements, into an evolutionary schema where the Brahma religion comes last. And Faith and Progress is in some ways a fulfillment theology that places all of the religions into the world into one shared narrative. And this is something that in the history of Christianity is a common facet of understanding religions vis-a-vis their fulfillment in one's own present. One last comment as time is running, that his Spirit of God in 1894 is written after the World Parliament of Religions in 1893. It is a piece of religious commentary on one hand. It is also a work informed by the literary spirit of the age of the 1890s. And it includes 17 chapters about how the Spirit lives. And he has himself a conversion narrative of how he came to appreciate the Spirit in various things, in nature, in life, in reason, in love, in conscience, and in Christ. It was by knowing Jesus of Nazareth that he came to know the Spirit in all religions and in all things. The work is a wide-ranging exploration of the notion of the Spirit as a force in history and also in the creation of a religious sentiment. And sentiment is something that for those who are working on 19th century literature, especially the novel, that sentiment is something that might be accessible vis-a-vis text. For him, he is saying quite explicitly that sentiment is something that is possibly known through reading, but it has to be felt through the Spirit. On world history, one may think of world history as a history of connections, as I mentioned. Connection via migration, connection via trade, connection via war. One may also find it as a site of comparison, comparing states, comparing religions, comparing social movements. Here I would like to draw your attention to the notion of religion as a site of world historical thought. are creatively thinking religion anew. Combos like PC Modular are engaging in a serious and sustained comparative project, examining the religions of the world, systematically engaging with them, not to rigidify religious boundaries, but to push at them and potentially create something new out of the raw materials of the religions of the world. And this is what makes religion a site of world historical thought for PC Modular. There's much else to say about the spirit in Christianity for those interested in that. He has a very detailed chapter on this, where he makes one point that is visible way back in the Tufa, a distinction between the external and the internal. And he claims that a reading of Christianity helps him understand this. The external form includes marble and canvas, monastery and cathedral, drama and poetry, whereas the internal form of religion is truth of the Holy Spirit. It has been exiled from the Christian sanctuary, meaning he is commenting on how missionaries and Christians who are engaging with him have been exempt from that truth. They are focused on the external. But the internal truth of Christianity is something that he is able to find because he has access to the Spirit in nature, Spirit in reason, Spirit in love. And when he discusses this, he also does this comparatively. He cites the Rig Veda, he cites the Psalms of David, he cites the Quran, and he claims they are all full of the intuitions of God from nature. He also integrates a historical understanding of those people relevant to his time. He mentions a variety of individuals across time and space. He mentions Joy Bunyan. He mentions Abraham Lincoln and the freedom of slaves in the United States of America. That was a major issue for those coming through North America. The role of abolition, slavery, and Christianity was on the topmost minds of those talking about Christianity in the late 19th century. He claims all of these individuals add only to the wonderful compassion in creation's cup, from which all lovers of God and man have drunk from age to age. And he ends this work, Spirit of God, 1894, by stating that the century is nearing its close like a long, dreary night, and over the darkened horizon of our many doubts and disbeliefs over this century, the dawn of a better day dimly smiles. And he mentions the rise of science as, in one hand, the gospel of the 19th century, but he hopes that the Spirit, about which he has written an entire book, is revealed through these stages of evolution. So, to conclude my discussion today, I would say that these comparative projects of the 19th century are important as they remind us that Indians not only in a distant past, but in the modern and colonial historical past. And we can see the 19th century bracketed by these projects. Comparison, continual learning through difference. And though there were certainly various other voices of the 19th century who did not see religion that way, let me just cite one of them, Dayanand Saraswati, and his very important book, Satyarth Prakash, which emerges in the 1870s with the creation of the Arya Samaj, another very important religious reform movement. That text, Satyarth Prakash, includes a chapter each on Christianity and Islam, and claims both of them to be foreign imports into India, and through a variety of methods, mostly text-critical, concludes that they are carriers of false religions. And at some level, this is the goal of Satyarth Prakash and of the Arya Samaj. But unlike that, these projects showcase a substantially comparative approach to religion alive for the entirety of the 19th century. Whether it is PC Mojumdar's many writings about Jesus of Nazareth, whether it is Girish Chandra Sen's translation of the Quran and many other translation projects, whether it is Girish Chandra Sen's vision of a synthesis of the religions of the world, all of them showcase religion to be a site of creative experimentation. And unlike comparative religion scholars in the West, like Max Muller, who focused on comparative religion as a method to understand religions outside of Christianity, to showcase how religions outside Christianity can be stood alongside Christianity, ultimately to convert non-Christians to Christianity, these figures that I have studied compare religion to reform religion itself, to reimagine religion for their time. Christianity was not simply imbibed nor rejected. It was creatively, willingly integrated into this process. In our current world, as discourses of bounded religions of Hinduism and Islam have become more and more salient, more and more visible, it was not that long ago that meanings and ends of religion were open-ended sites of critical investigation. They were linked not to bounded categories, linked to locality, tradition, or nation, but rather in the service of the transcendence of those boundaries themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bose, for a very interesting talk covering the entire 19th century and a wide range of engagements, primarily between proto-Brahmos and Brahmos, because when Rammohan wrote the Tufat, of course it wasn't a Brahmo, with Islam, with Christianity, and since we do some of this with our students, I'm sure there might be quite a bit of interested engagement. For my part, I had one very specific interest. I wanted to ask you about Bhai Pratap's looking at the historical Jesus, whether by that time he had been exposed to the writings of either Ludwig Feuerbach or David Strauss, because these seem the immediate points of contact.
Professor Gold, I mean, it was so clear, and I don't know anything about, almost nothing about, there's really comparative religion and, its importance in India in the 19th century, but, creating connections, integrating, and crossing of boundaries. So, and there was one religion, you haven't referred to, but that's a strange type of religion, not that I know much about it, but I am curious to know your view about that is theosophy. It is crossing boundary, but from the other side. So I would just like to, know if, where do you place theosophy as in this, draft comparative religion that you have drawn so far?
I think if you would like to address Chaitanya, and then I had a question.
The almost direct reader and revealing or reflecting from Purbat of the spirit almost directly. And oddly enough, through this very strong interest in Christianity, but starting from various points that would have been probably strange to Purbat if he knew. He had a troubled relationship with Christianity. He had at times struggled with how to reconcile its manifestation and vis-a-vis missionaries and the textual reading that he was doing. And Purbat helped when he got to the end. At that level, for those who are interested in that kind of approach, they definitely would be profitably read together. And it only would help us to keep pure that in mind when we think of PC Modular. On theosophy, I would say that it is a parallel to some degree of what is happening with Bose, but coming from another angle of this dissatisfaction with the state of religion in the West and an interest in a whole range of non-textual, non-scientific sources that throughout the 19th century so many European thinkers are interested in the so-called occult and various forces that can be felt. And there is a convergence at some level. So if we think of world history as connecting and comparing, it is perhaps best to think of them as parallel comparative movements, theosophy and the Brahmo surge. There is some new work, if those who are interested in this topic, that just came out called Global Tantra, and then there's a work called Global Theosophy, and it situates theosophy into a study of how Indian interlocutors understood theosophy. And in many cases it was understood as European philosophy, and in some cases it was understood as a different form of science. The meeting points of that, I think, are yet to be fully studied. So this is a point of ongoing and emergent research.
No, but I'm also interested because the animism, for example, she contributed such a lot to Indian national movement. And the connection between, a certain kind of religious awakening, reformative movement, I would say, and the idea that it can be a tool to revive or some extent create a kind of new nationalism, but with a kind of a syncretic mixture of different religions. So that was what I was thinking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Others in the audience?
Question.
This with the Bengali Muslim intelligentsia, we can see that at that time Mehrullah or other persons engaged with Mihir Sudhakar or Sultan, they were also engaging with the reform, but they were not that much dynamic like this thoughts. So
or I know there are more questions, let's put it very clearly there, but I was wondering how you would look at it theoretically in terms of a lived experience. You speak about lived experience using strategy, so that was something I'm really curious about. Thank you again.
Girish Chandra Sen's Brahma Samaj of India as a search for newer interests in monotheism, like you mentioned Girish Chandra Sen's translation of Quran, at a time when the Brahma Samaj of India was facing disintegration owing to the Kuch Bihar incident.
Contribute if they would like to. But on the question of reform in Mehrullah and Bengali Muslim intelligentsia, I think myself and others who have worked on this would argue that there was an internalist understanding of reform within Muslim communities that does not depend on colonial knowledge, it does not depend on the presence of missionaries. The term reform, I think, as Francis Robinson, who is one of his major reviews of this topic, offers, is that reform is internal to Islam itself, and it often is used in different ways in different contexts. The term I'm using here is explicitly based on this engagement with traditions outside of oneself, which may not be how reform is understood within those circles that you have mentioned, which would be an internalist conversation that happens to coincidentally in historical time match with a very aggressive onslaught of Christian missionary attack on Islam in various forms, and also a coincidental socioeconomic emplacement of Muslims, such that the turn inward is encouraged by their precarious state. So the content of reform and then the political performance of it are very different of Bengali Muslims. And this is something that many scholars who have worked on this have investigated. I would say that, as I'm saying here, the people who are studying Islam in this fashion are not fully aware of those internal debates. Whereas in the context of Muslim reform, there already are so many internal directions of a conversation about reform. And so those are two separate, in a way, almost two separate histories. On that point, I would invite Dr. Mateen, Dr. Halder, if they have anything to add to this discussion, because they have worked on these questions.
Religion through the study of comparative literature, because there were many issues that you raised which dealt with literary circulation, politics of translation, construction of literary communities and other sorts of things that are generally dealt with in the purview of comparative literature. From there, I just wanted to ask one conceptual question to echo what Girish asked, which you actually raised in your conclusion. But I wrote my question before that, so I have to ask this question. That is, these processes of creation of a new religious reform. I mean, these processes were integrally connected to, say, a multilingual, multi-generic, I would say, multi-source understanding of religion and other sorts of discourses. So I was just wondering, this kind of mobilization, both spatially and in terms of the mental processes, how they offer another understanding of, say, identity, another sort of identity connected to, say, the region and also to the trans-territorial domain, which can be employed as a critique of a linear understanding of nationalism that is based on the idea of, say, formation of monolingual practices and standardization of a community based on the idea of a jati, which was so inherent in Dayanand Saraswati's understanding of religious reform. But can we place all these ideas of world religion as a sort of critique of territorial nationalism? That was my question. I have two other questions, but I'll ask them later. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was fascinating. Thanks a lot.
I would like to, so we can keep the discussion in line, I would like to quickly respond to the other question, and this will hopefully also respond to the question about salvation. So, I guess I could give a short answer. The short answer is yes, but a longer answer is speaking to the discussions we have been having all day about methods as a critique of, I would say, both linear models of nationalism and a critique of the role of religion in nationalism. We need not only point to our imagination to find sources for an identity, if we want to call it that, or a way of life that rejects these bounded categories. We actually have a vast amount of sources in our modern history, and we need only to look at those sources and to understand them in the proper context, not as aspects of a periphery of a landscape of unending, let's say, text and context, but rather the actual core sources of our history of religion in the modern world do not tend to a linear nor bounded religious nationalism. Those sources in our modern history can be marshaled to remake our present understanding of what we mean by Indian religion. It might actually mean something very different than what we take it to be in the contemporary. So that's a long way of saying yes, and methodologically that we might orient our gaze on doing the kind of studies that keep those modern moments alive. They are not from a distant or inaccessible past, nor are they only in the mind or in the imagined past. They are in a past that is very much with us. And so that also, I think, would address the question about comparative religion as a source of salvation. I would say that the historiography of comparative religion in the Western world is shrouded in a whole series of anxieties. Analogous to the history of anthropology, comparative religion has a genealogy connected to a very rigid disciplinary attitude in the West. Comparative religion, in the context that I have presented, is a form of comparative study that need not start with those foundations that is plaguing the Western world's understanding of comparative studies. It may easily be grounded again in these sources that I have mentioned, and in methods that are well known to us across the humanities, regardless of where we may reside. So again, is a longer way of saying yes, that comparative religion is a site that might perhaps reactivate a humanism that has been lost for various reasons. And I'll say one last thing before I would like to invite others to join on the conversation, including Dr. Abdul Martin, who is here with us, about the Kuch Bihar episode, which many of you may know about, which hurt the popularity of the Brahmo Samaj because of the wedding of Girish Chandra Sen's daughter. I would say that there are, again speaking to the issue of methods, the history of the Brahmo Samaj is often written through the perspective of institutional histories. And it is very true that in that moment, in the late 1870s and 1880s, because of this wedding, the Brahmo Samaj and especially Keshav fell out of favor amongst many. And if we follow a purely institutional or social history of the Brahmo Samaj, we will also find that that is a time of decline of membership. It is a time of great attacks on the Brahmo Samaj from various quarters, whether it would be caste Hindus who opposed what they were doing, whether it would be older Brahmos from the other Brahmo Samaj who opposed what they were doing, whether it would be Christians who opposed what they were doing. They were vehemently attacked at the time. So the numbers go down, popularity goes down. But the genealogical method and intellectual histories of their projects must compel a different method. And they rise in the 1880s. So as the social world is declining, membership is declining, there is also a rise in these sorts of openness to different traditions. And they cannot be reduced to one another. So they have their own life, the openness and the engagement with traditions from afar, which will predate Keshav Chandra Sen, and they certainly live on after his death. On that, I would like to invite anyone else to join, especially Dr. Abdul Martin, if he has any comments or contributions to this discussion.
Thank you, Professor Bose. This is absolutely so clear that I don't have a question, but I just want to point out one thing that when you said that Asiatic grade, while discussing that Mojumdal, when you were discussing what constitute the Asiatic grade, is there any kind of intellectual engagement with the Marxist understanding of the Asiatic mode of productions? Do you find any such and then second thing is that as far as Bengal Islam is concerned, as he has worked on it, I mean this is really very difficult and tough terrain, in the sense like there are many Islams, and if you look at the methodology of Professor Imtiaz Ahmed and the idea of lived Islam, and if you apply that method here in Bengal, and questions like caste and jati will definitely come. And I mean, we really need to put our heads together and to think like what would be our new methodological and conceptual tools and categories to unfold or to understand the different issue. For example, what Seema has raised the issue of reform. Reform in 19th century means many things to many groups. For example, like the whole idea of if you look at the literature of Maulana Ruhul Amin, what we call Ahl Sunnat Jamaat, and their literature of reforms comes within the larger Hanafi discourse, and which is very different from the school of Ahl Hadith and other forms. Therefore, what constitutes reform, that itself is again a difficult conceptual questions. I think maybe Shidati can organize a good workshop so that we can have, and of course, and we just planning for the last couple of weeks, like, then we can have little details of both empirical evidences, literary text, and even going beyond literary text. Like, that is also another important tools to understand Islam at the margins of Bengali Islam, going beyond text. And what, I mean, not exactly the oral traditions, like for example, Waz Mahfil and all. And how Waz Mahfil, as Stevie has brought on it, and how Waz Mahfil creates new kind of discourses. Because one hand we see absolutely misogynist kind of Waz Mahfil which are there in different parts, both in East Bengal as well as in West. On the other hand, we see a very reformist traditions within the Waz Mahfil circle. And how they are engaging with the idea of nations, idea of state, idea of community, idea of empowerment. So you see a lot of contemporary Muslim improvement text. That's also been circulated in contemporary last 2 decades, especially after such a committee report. So therefore, we need to connect with the post-Sacher affairs with the 19th century. So we could see some sort of interaction is there. I mean, I'm really thankful to Professor Bose, like at least giving some sort of orientations, especially the methodological details about approaching religion in that point of time. And many thanks, and we are looking forward for this great workshop from this center.
About a modern kind of sobriety. So they were sort of reorganizing several genres, introducing several new genres, and I would say reforming the older genres as well, where we would see a kind of evolutionary discourse that they were borrowing from their colonial exposure to the colonial, to colonial modernity. And at the same time, they were talking about a new definition of rationality that was coming out of their own understanding of their religious discourses. We can specifically talk about how the Islamic reformers, Bengali speaking, they were actually Maulana Akram Khan, from Ruhul Amin to Maulana Akram Khan, from Noimuddin to say Mehrullah, they were talking about a different sort of rationality. So when T.C. Mazumdar was talking about the Asiatic, where while the Asiatic mode of production, the light of Asia, Buddha as the light of Asia, and also Asia as the East as structure. So when he was conceptualizing the Asiatic, was he going against or sort of creating a different sort of discourse on the Asiatic? That was my question. So what was this? What were the parameters of this Asiatic while borrowing evolutionary framework, the evolutionary framework, and certain sort of rationalism?
I would say yes, a very important issue that perhaps awaits a full exploration, because I believe that the meanings and markers of Asiatic in this context have yet to be actually fully explored. And I would say that in this context, this is of course an Asiatic that emerges, depending on which texts, it has a tangled relationship with the writings of Marx, although he's not reading Marx in that way. But the term Asiatic is there, is in existence outside of India. He's taking it from Girish Chandra Sen, who uses the term in his Jesus Christ, Europe and Asia, and he introduces a schematic for understanding an Asiatic mode of religiosity. This is 1866. And that Asiatic mode, after that, T.C. Mazumdar continues. So that is the foundation. What is that Asiatic mode? As I mentioned, it's based on metaphor and symbol. And to the degree that it is simply a counter to what Christians and others are saying about India, and the degree to which it is born out of a substantive exploration of text and practice in India has not been fully discussed. But I would say that the fact that it is in that force field of an awareness of this audience, of how Christians will read it, is very relevant. So the Asiatic Christ is something that is meant for both Brahmos and Christians, their friends, and some of their opponents to read. And that, I think, is central to that Asiatic. There's more on that notion from other angles, but that is somewhat afield from this discussion. So I will leave it there, but I will also say that the workshop that Dr. Naldin has mentioned, which I very much look forward to, could include a